Greetings, everyone. My name is Daryl Heller. I am the director of the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center, and I want to welcome everyone here tonight for this wonderful event on reflections on Toni Morrison. As you know, Toni Morrison is one of the towering, not only writers in literature, but one of the towering intellectuals of the 20th and 21st centuries. So I'm just really proud and pleased that we're able to kind of spend some time talking about her work, sharing, having conversations and dialogues together. Those of you who are tuning in, I'm actually standing behind the camera, so you don't see me, but welcome to you as well, those who are joining us virtually. I am going to turn this over to Dr. Mark Sanders, who is the director of the Initiative for Race and Resiliency at Notre Dame, who will guide and lead us through this evening. And we're really pleased to be collaborating with the center tonight. So thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Daryl. Good evening. I hope you all are doing well. A formal thank you to Mr. Daryl Heller, Professor Daryl Heller, and George Garner. Without your work to help to organize this event, this would absolutely be impossible. And of course, thank you all for being here. This is a wonderful turnout for what is sure to be an edifying conversation about Toni Morrison. I'm the director of the Initiative on Race and Resilience at Notre Dame, and we have the honor and privilege of partnering with the Civil Rights Heritage Center to bring you this critical discussion of Toni Morrison's work and legacy. The Initiative on Race is a gathering of scholars, students, artists, and community organizers, all working to confront systemic racism and support communities of color. Global in scope, comparative and interdisciplinary in critical approach, the initiative works to realize its vision through three essential areas of work: research, education, and community engagement. For more information on our activities, please just go to the Notre Dame website and type in Initiative on Race, and you'll get much more information. We feel that reflecting on Toni Morrison's work speaks to the core mission of the initiative, and that all of our panelists have, of course, conducted research on Ms. Morrison. What they have to say will surely be educational, and in terms of forging community through all of her writings, Toni Morrison has pushed us to ask how we might form more nurturing, sustainable communities, how we might live in a world without racism and sexism, and how we might get there. Last week, February 18th, was Toni Morrison's 91st birthday, right in the middle of Black History Month, and so we thought it would be fitting to reflect on her legacy as a part of our month-long observation of Black history. And who better represents Black history than Toni Morrison? Her historical novels and the ways in which her fiction and essays have indeed shaped history. Pulitzer Prize winner, Nobel Laureate, Presidential Medal of Freedom holder, editor who has helped to launch the careers of Gail Jones, Toni K. Pambara, Henry Dumas, Angela Davis, and many more, and a literary critic who helped to usher in a new era of criticism on race, one that insists upon the close examination of whiteness as a constitutive element of a modern understanding of race. I could go on, but this is the work of the panel. Suffice it to say at this point that Toni Morrison is the most influential writer in English in the second half of the 20th century, and thus far into the 21st. And so let me introduce our panelists from my right to left. First is Professor Serena Johnson-Rouliere. She is the author of Reading on the Edge, Exiles, Modernities, and Cultural Transformation in Proust, Joyce, and Baldwin, and has published essays on modernism, literary and feminist theory, African American literature, and literature of the Americas, in addition to a number of essays on systemic racism, which has appeared in Ms. Magazine and the Chicago Tribune, among other publications. A former Ford Fellow, Professor Johnson-Rouliere has held visiting appointments in literature of the Americas in the Frank Institute of the Center of Study of Race and Politics and Culture at the University of Chicago, and in Emergent Literatures, Literature of the Americas at the University of Geneva in Geneva, Switzerland. She is currently at work on a manuscript exploring the intersection of race and the race and the human through the lens of law and utopia in Atlantic America. And as you see, her presentation is Black History Month, Toni Morrison, and the amazing power of the prefix "re." Next will be Mr. Eric T. Stiles. Since 2016, he has served as the rector of Carroll Hall at the University of Notre Dame. A Chicago native, he holds degrees from the University of Cincinnati and Loyola University in Chicago. Eric worked as a parish liturgy coordinator at St. Benedict, the African Catholic Church in Chicago, and as a house manager for the theater school of DePaul University. He discerned religious life for 7 years with the Society of Jesus, during which time he prayed the 30-day retreat designed by St. Ignatius Loyola and received formal training in spiritual direction. He later left the Jesuits and eventually found his way to St. Mary's University of Minnesota, where he worked as a campus minister for liturgy and faith formation. Now at Notre Dame, he continues to assist as a retreat leader and an occasional spiritual director. Eric remains active in the performing arts as a collaborator with Afro House, a Baltimore-based music-driven performance art ensemble. And Eric writes about theology, literature, and contemporary culture for publications such as America, Church Life Journal, and U.S. Catholic. His presentation will address Catholic institutions and their engagement of Toni Morrison's work. And next will be Miss Margaret Mcgreevy. And I should say Margaret accepted my invitation right in the last minute, this time last week. So we really appreciate her being able to step in literally at the 11th hour. Ms. Mcgreevy is a South Bend native and a senior at the University of Notre Dame, studying English and philosophy. She is currently writing a senior honors thesis about identity, intersectionality, and Toni Morrison's novel. She is interested in teaching. She has applied to a Fulbright, and her post-Notre Dame plans are still in formation. She will address identity and intersectionality in 3 of Notre Dame's novels. And then last, but certainly not least, my other additional colleague in the English department, Professor Francisco Robles. He's an assistant professor of English at the University of Notre Dame. He teaches and researches in American literatures of the 20th century and focusing in particular on multi-ethnic American literature. His current book project, Migrant Modes, Aesthetics on the Move in Mid-Century U.S. Multi-Ethnic Writing, examines literary and musical representations of migrants in the United States, spanning from the 1930s to the 1980s. The project asserts that the aesthetic and political legacies of the Popular Front transform into the Progressive Party's coalitional post-war platform, which in turn shifts from the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which has its own resonance and legacies in the 1970s. Some of the texts he examines is Migrant Modes. In Migrant Modes are by Zora Neale Hurston, Muriel Rukeyser, Sonora Bob, Carlos Bulosan, Woody Guthrie, Americo Paredes, Tomas Rivera, Los Lobos, Alice Walker, and Odetta. And the other authors included in this bridge called My Back. And his presentation is titled Why Brazil Matters to Toni Morrison. Please welcome our panelists, and we will begin with Professor.
Thank you so much. I wish you could see that I'm actually smiling at you. I'm trying really hard to do it with my eyes, so I hope it means something. Thank you so much, Mark, for your introduction, and thank you all for spending time with us tonight. So I'm just going to jump right in. You can see my title right there. Remembering the late Toni Morrison as part of Black History Month can't just be about remembering. Simply the act of calling something again to mind. That might sound a little strange, but not if we dig deeper, not just into Morrison's work, but into what lies behind it. We need to remember Morrison, especially during Black History Month, especially in our current racial and political climate, and especially now. But even more so, because on August 5th, 2019, Toni Morrison passed forever into our collective memory. As a result, barring the unbelievable and utterly welcome discovery of a priceless, unpublished manuscript in some as yet unknown attic, as Irma McLaurin writes in an essay on remembering Morrison, there will now be no new words added to the wisdom that Morrison gave to all of us who remain all over the world. Such words are now no longer possible. But if we try to see beyond the actual words Morrison has left behind, we open a door to remembering, a way to experience an act of remembering that not only recalls what Morrison has named rememory, but also radically changes what we were actually doing when we remember as opposed to when we just remember. So, since I said in my title that it's about the amazing power of re, I'm going to say re all over the place until you get sick of hearing it. Morrison often uses the term remembering in her groundbreaking novel, Beloved. It is a new and unfamiliar word, but we shouldn't make the mistake of believing that this is only an ethnic departure from standard English or a quirk of the novel's central concern regarding the unearthly reality of its titular character. In one particular instance in the novel, Morrison makes clear that rememory is actually about the tangled relation between memory and remembering in a more complicated sense of time. At this point in the novel, Sita explains to her daughter Denver what was happening for her in a moment when Denver believes she saw her mother praying with a strange woman in a white dress from another time by her side, her arm encircling Sita's waist. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory. Some things you forget, other things you never do. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone. But the picture of it stays, and not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. What this moment tells us about remembering is that it is much more than either memory or simple remembering. It is also about how both of these texts locate themselves in time, about the layering of past, present, and future, and how these can and do exist together. It is about how this relation makes of time itself a permanent simultaneity in which we remember and we forget as we remember, and vice versa, always with the past pushing into the present while creating hope for the future. In this sense, rememory seeks to describe the problematic and horrific reality of the slave experience, and it is only in this frame that the character Beloved becomes fully comprehensible. Okay, now I'm gonna get real. This is not how I understood the novel when I first encountered it in the late 1980s. At the time, I was a graduate student teaching an evening class on women of color to an eager group of young Black women. Beloved was on the syllabus, and they were struggling. Frankly, I was struggling too. Why couldn't the novel just tell its story? Why do you keep jumping around from past to present and back again? What on earth was the point of including a ghost? Didn't that just make it stupid? But if it was so stupid, why was everyone talking about it? And why had I ever chosen to put it on my syllabus? Despite all these questions, I decided that a more focused engagement was called for, if only to provide a viable path of understanding for my students. I did find such a path. And then from that journey, all my questions totally disappeared, overwhelmed by the deeper, completely unexpected understanding I myself obtained from the effort. Beloved was a ghost, but this was not at all stupid. It was, in fact, necessary, because Beloved existed and could only exist as a haunting, a symbol of how all Black people in America were consciously or unconsciously plagued by the ceaseless insertion of the legacy of slavery into their present, and from there, its equally problematic effect on their future. In an essay which was published in The Guardian just 3 days after her death, Morrison addresses what motivated her to write Beloved. It was in Beloved that all of these matters coalesced for me in new and major ways, she writes. History versus memory, and memory versus memorylessness. Rememory as in recollecting, and remembering as in reassembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past. In calling upon remembering, Morrison transforms remembering into something much larger, something that opens itself more widely to the past in the effort to reclaim what that past has stolen, so as to firmly seize and reanimate it for the future. In so doing, she encourages us, through rememory, to pay closer attention to the relation between memory and the past, how that enters into our present, and finally, to be conscious of the ways in which the past can either repress or reinvigorate that future. As we follow this trajectory, it is possible to see that in this, Morrison also offers a way to move beyond the damaging effects of the past into a future reforged, primed to reincorporate the Black body into the body politic of America, from which the fact of slavery excluded it. Excuse me, just a second. In so doing, Morrison points to an understanding that in remembering, we revisit, but in remembering, we position ourselves also to recreate. This is the unspoken imperative of Morrison's work, the place where our own memory blends with her notion of rememory, leading us to that moment where remembering transforms itself into a remembering that can also rebuild. As Morrison writes, her work is focused on history versus memory, and memory versus memorylessness, as I said above. It is the impetus to this act of remaking, ultimately to reimagine, that will, that must, take the place of that gift of words we can no longer receive from Morrison herself. As she explained in a 1986 interview with Sandy Russell, I write for Black women. Black women writers look at things in an unforgiving, loving way. They are writing to repossess, rename, reown. We are right in line if this becomes the task of our own remembering. Black History Month is a time not only to celebrate the legacy of Black people's contributions to our national culture, but also, as is expressed in the meaning of history itself, to make ourselves aware of the past, to remember that past, and to honor it. Once remembered, however, the past that Black History Month commemorates becomes also a time to recognize the beauty and richness of those contributions. This need is just as urgent now, in February 2022, as it has been throughout the history of America. Now is a moment in time encompassing not only the multitude of racial struggles in America stretching back to the year 1619, as we are reminded by Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of the 1619 Project, But those that have continued into the 21st century with the Black Lives Matter movement and the seemingly endless killing of Black people, innocent Black people, the latest being 22-year-old Amir Locke from Minneapolis, killed by police just this year. The notorious trials of their killers, among them Jason Van Dyke, Derek Chauvin, Greg and Travis McMichael, and William Roddy Bryan. The ongoing battle over voting rights and the enormously popularized and politicized debate around critical race theory, especially as concerns the development of the 1619 Project as a K-12 curriculum. But remembering alone is not enough. We must also remember to ensure that we will find ourselves in a world where rememory can build a newly reimagined reality through which the legacy of that past is utterly transformed. Through such rememory, I am carried back to another time, a place, as Sita describes, that is still there, a picture that stays. It is the memory of a past that in rememory still exists in the present, moving on to a future remade, where it becomes not just a vision, but truly real. In that time and in that place, there exists a picture of some of those who have now gone forever. Quiet, honest, family-oriented, hardworking, church-going, upstanding Black people, old enough to have suffered the many horrors of the direct aftermath of slavery in our time, but who lived long enough to see into a future of boundless possibility for Black youth, a future that would, at least in a physical sense, arrive too late for them, yet reach far beyond their own dreams of the possible, speaking of things they could only try to imagine. But in that picture, this does not matter. Such vast possibility allowed them to see far ahead, deep into another world in which they could and did take part, nevertheless. Sharing in my youth with these silent, dignified people, the coming time that lay before me, the fruits of education soundly within my grasp, I felt an incalculable beauty in the quivering depths of their intense pride, mixed with a joy so profound it could not be contained. It found itself instead suffused through their eyes in a blindingly bright, soft light that I have seen neither before nor since, as their gaze traveled beyond me into a hazy future that in rememory we shared, full to overflowing with the amazing power of the prefix re. Thank you.
Should I go? Oh, thank you, Dr. Johnson Rouliere. I don't need it, so thank you. Would you do me a favor and go back to just one image of Toni Morrison? We'll leave it there. That'd be great, right?
Sure. We can go all the way back.
That beautiful one for she's getting
That
a profile.
one of her, yes.
Of her profile.
That's
wonderful.
That. Yeah, that's good for us.
That's right. That's right. As Dr. Sanders said, my name is Eric Stiles, and I work at the University of Notre Dame as a rector, which means my job is to pastor young people in a residence hall. And they live there. We live together and try to work it out, if that makes any sense to you. This is their primary community for most of them. And the good and the bad and the ugly happens all together right there in that place. But outside of being a rector, I feel overwhelmed because I'm not in the classroom. I haven't been in school in a long time. I don't have a PhD. I couldn't even call myself a novice Toni Morrison fan. I can't even say that. But I've been fascinated by her. I know more about her as a critic and a commentator than I do as a novelist. But what I typically do was give my mother, every time a new book came out, I'd send my mother a copy. Toni, yeah. But I wanted to talk about her because I was asked to talk about her because I have a ongoing significant interest in the intersection between Black experience and Catholicism. That's really what I'm interested in. What does it mean to be Black and Catholic? And what will that look like right here in this country versus or anywhere else? It's an underserved population in many ways. Black Catholics make up perhaps even up, as some say, up to 7% of the African American population in the United States. And there are more Black Catholics than there are Episcopalians altogether in the United States. Somewhere around 3 million African American Catholics in the United States. And we certainly are being booned by a population of folks coming from the mother continent, right? And when we think about Catholicism, people in America don't think about Black people at all, for the most part. But the reality is, in Africa, Catholicism is a very standard and common, probably somewhere between 30 to 50 to 60% of the population in any given country that is Christian would be Catholic, right? So it's just a very standard, just what people are. For example, I know that Dr. Sanders is a specialization in Latin American culture and literature, right? There are so many Black people in Latin America, and the majority of Black people, Latin Americans are Catholic, or at least culturally Catholic. But in the United States, it's a different story. And you wonder why. And there are lots of reasons we could talk about that, but that's not the topic of the day. The topic of the day is really what Toni Morrison might bring to the table and how she might engage the Catholic imagination, or how she already has. Most people probably don't know that Toni Morrison was Catholic. That she became Catholic at around the age of 12. In fact, her name, Toni, is her confirmation name, right? Her given name was Chloe, or is Chloe. But she chose Saint Anthony of Padua as her patron saint when she got confirmed. That many people in her family were Methodist, and some were also Catholic, and she would go to church with her cousin, and she just liked it, and she became Catholic. She was a very private person, so she didn't talk about this a whole lot most of her career, but in her later years, she began to talk about being Catholic in varying ways, right? So sometimes she would say, well, I've kind of moved beyond that, right? And then sometimes she would say, well, I'm Catholic. And she was in a conversation with, which we could find on the internet, a conversation with Cornel West, and they were talking, somehow the conversation around The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson came up. And she said, well, we Catholics, and she went on to talk about we like the gore. We don't do just crosses, we do crucifixes, bodies. But the reality is that folks have been engaging her. Some important people in the Black Catholic community have been engaging her work for many, many years. So let me just say really something quickly about what we might call the Catholic imagination. And let's just say in really quick terms, if there were two ways, this is a heuristic, right? Just a way of talking. It is not trying to accomplish all things. But if there were two ways to think about imagination, there might be, particularly in the Christian context, would be the dialectical imagination, which primarily thinks in either ors, so sin and grace. And those two things kind of are in opposition to one another, right? You're either saved or you're a sinner. I mean, I'm making really large generalizations, right? Or what's called the analogical imagination. And I'm going to spend just a minute talking about that, which is God is everywhere, right? Almost we're the analogy. God is the reality, right? And that God is in creation, God is present, God is always present. And so instead of either or, we're thinking both and. Right? So in other words, sin and grace live together all the time. So Catholic imagination would lean towards the analogical, right? Looking for grace in the tactile world. This is why sacramentality is so important. That not only are we saved by ideas, but we're saved by experience, tactile, ritual experience that points to God's presence in the world, in the given world. So that's how we might think about talking about what we call a sacramental or a Catholic imagination. And there are really writers now talking about Toni Morrison in those veins. Not only because she was Catholic, but because she imbued much of her work with these ideas, but also Catholic characters kind of find their way in the periphery. They're there, but they're not always the center, right? But they're operative, right? Because they were a part of her imagination. So two scholars that have spent a little time in dialoguing, two African-American Catholic scholars. One by the name, I'm going to go with Sean Copeland first because it's going to be the most obvious, right? Dr. Sean Copeland is a theologian, and she was here at Notre Dame last semester. I also actually know these people, so it's really kind of nice to talk about people that you actually know. Dr. Copeland is professor emerita of theology at Boston College. And she is a preeminent womanist scholar and a Catholic, right? And so then you bring out books like Enfleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being, which is a seminal work in womanist and Catholic theology, right? The intersection between the two. And she talks about using beloved as, she says that this book is kind of a meditation, a broad, meditation on beloved. Because it's a book of theological anthropology. What does it mean to be human? And she foregrounds Black womanhood in the book. And she foregrounds images, historical images of Black women not only surviving, but thriving and making a world even through slavery. Okay? And she ends with a meditation both on the Eucharist and a bit on Toni Morrison's Beloved. So she brings Beloved up multiple times and talks about how Toni Morrison emphasizes the subjectivity of Black women and their power to make sense of the world in the midst of distress, great distress. That's one. And the other one is Father Joseph Brown. He's a Jesuit priest, and he is a professor of Africana Studies at Southern Illinois University. And Joseph's book is called To Stand on the Rock, Meditations on Black Catholic Identity. In many ways, there was a time when these books traveled with me everywhere. Like literally, when I left, just in case I had a few minutes, I didn't know what to do with my time, I would pull out one of these two books. Because for me, they are yin and yang. So Father Joseph tries to develop what we might call a genealogy of Black Catholic spirituality. So how can we trace a Black Catholic experience all the way back to Africa and through the Americas, or through the United States especially, and the resilience of that, right? And what does it mean to be, in other words, another attempt at trying to answer the question, what does it mean to be Black and Catholic? And he does a really interesting turn at the end. He has degrees in both in spiritual or theology and English and Africana studies, okay? So he's a poet and very much an artist, right? But at the end, he says, well, what's the model for Black priesthood? And he decides that that's Baby Shugs in Beloved, that she is the model for a Black priesthood, which is kind of ironic, right? And he describes how the work that she does in the clearing is what a priest is called to do in the Black Catholic community. Right? So they are using Toni Morrison's work to construct a Black theology. They're one of the things they're using, not just her, but one of the things that they're using. And I find it really fascinating because I'm interested in that question, more interested in the Black theology than I am, because I'm not great at staying with the novels long enough to get through them, because her work is very dense, right? But I find this stuff really interesting. And then I want to just address what you said about remembering, because I instantly thought about a category in Catholic theology that has roots in the Jewish tradition, where there's a word, anamnesis, that refers to remembering, and it is re-membering. So when you remember in this way, that which you remember is fully present now, right now. So every time the Catholics celebrate the Eucharist, we are saying Jesus is fully present right now. That it's not we're not putting Jesus on the cross again and again and again, like some Protestants sometimes think we are, right? But in fact, this is the one experience of Jesus on the cross. We're tapping into that one timeless experience, right? Right? We are the ones who are moving in time more than maybe Jesus is, in a sense, right? So this notion that Jesus is truly present when we gather, in a way that when people go to the cemetery and add another chair and sit with the one who was gone but is not gone. I'd also like to think we can do that with Toni Morrison, I would hope, by reading her work, by listening to her. So I would like to say that Toni Morrison was perhaps what others have been referred to as a mystic of open eyes. This is a category that comes from a theologian by the name of Jean-Baptiste Metz, right? Sees the world as it is and sees grace operating in that world. So Toni Morrison does not allow us to flinch at evil. She looks at evil. There's actually a book that came out very recently, show and tell today, right? Toni Morrison, The Goodness and the Literary Imagination. And I'm really salty that this was at Harvard and not at Notre Dame, this conference that happened actually some years ago. And I've been pushing Mark Sanders, and I will make my pitch once more, that there needs to be a conference on Toni Morrison and the sacramental imagination at a place like Notre Dame, right? That the Catholic community will be not only enriched, but like more complete by listening, by reflecting on a person like Toni Morrison, who in fact was Catholic, and allowed the Catholic imagination to shape, right? And her imagination, and also interrogated in a very specific way. So you mentioned before interrogating whiteness. And I think that in the Catholic tradition, particularly in the United States, there was a great need to distinguish between that which might be called Catholic, which means universal and inclusive, quite frankly, and which is white. So the notion that we typically associate white Catholicism with Catholicism versus one instantiation of a larger tradition. She can help us do that, I think, to tease out and then make space for example, not only, but for what Black Catholicism might be in this country versus, or how it's operating in all kinds of places all around the world. Yeah. And I'm going to probably get close to the end here and then maybe read a quote of hers, okay? That the Catholic intellectual tradition at its best, and there is an intellectual tradition that we can call Catholic, okay? That at its best has the capacity to absorb ideas and receive them and enculturate the gospel in any particular moment at its best. It doesn't dismiss ideas that are new. And so Notre Dame, for example, this is what the famed Father Hesburgh many years ago said about Notre Dame. He said once, Notre Dame can and must be a crossroads where all the vital intellectual currents of our time meet in dialogue, where the great issues of the church and the world today are plumbed to their depths, where every sincere inquirer is welcomed and listened to and respected by a serious consideration of what he or she has to say about their belief or unbelief, her certainty or uncertainty, where differences of culture and religion and conviction can coexist with friendship, civility, hospitality, and love, respect and love, a place where the endless conversation is harbored and not foreclosed. Right? In other words, a place where Catholicism is actually being done and not just being talked about. And so if we're not there, Black folks, then the conversation is incomplete. Right? And so I think Toni Morrison is a way in because you cannot ignore her. She's too important to our culture to be ignored. Right? And she says, by the way, I'm Catholic. And so then I'll leave it at this. She said this, and this I guess is in The Source of Self-Regard, which is an anthology of her writings, her nonfiction writings. She said, I am a writer and my faith is in the world of art is intense, but not irrational or naive. Art invites us to take the journey beyond price, beyond costs, into bearing witness to the world as it is and as it should be. Thanks.
Thank you. I feel so honored to be up here with all of you who are esteemed academics. As Professor Sanders said, I'm working on my thesis right now, but I thought I would give you all a little kind of journey into how I was introduced to Toni Morrison and how I'm thinking of her now in terms of my work that I'm doing in my research. So regrettably, I was not taught any Toni Morrison in high school. I didn't read her till I took a course in college with Professor Ernest Morrell, where we read 7 of her novels and criticism. So I felt like I got thrown in the deep end of Toni Morrison in the best way possible. But even though I was in the deep end, I realized that it was just the tip of the iceberg. Talking about 7 novels over the course of a semester, there's no way to, get all that you can from each of those novels. So I knew that I had to continue to read them and investigate them, and that's why I chose to write about them for my thesis. I also bring to my work my background in philosophy as well. I'm an English and philosophy major. So it was important for me to integrate those 2 things into the work that I'm doing. And now I very proudly classify Toni Morrison as a philosopher. And I think more people will start to do so, and some people have already. The other thing that I bring is an interest in identity and intersectionality, and that's sort of the topic of my thesis. So I learned a lot about intersectionality in philosophy classes, interestingly enough. We talked a lot about how abstract concepts like whiteness, like blackness, like being a woman, how they're really unstable when you start to investigate them, because there are always counterexamples, a woman who doesn't fit exactly into what you think being a woman might be. So I was interested that identity is both unstable and so important to how we view ourselves. So I began to look more at intersectional identities, the more specific identities that describe a unique position where different oppressions meet, but also just different experiences meet. And that seemed to embody more lived experience. So labels like Black womanhood or Black queer womanhood are going to be more explanatorily powerful and fundamental than abstract categories like blackness or whiteness. So that's kind of where I come from on the philosophy side. And I'm really integrating that with my love of these novels. But I also thought I would kind of give you all a little window into why I think Toni Morrison is a philosopher, looking at her views on language, language as knowledge, language as an epistemology, as well as identity, which is the subject of my thesis. So hopefully I do a good job on that part. So I thought I would read a passage first from the Nobel lecture, Toni Morrison's Nobel lecture. And I think that it kind of links up well because it is a retelling of a biblical narrative, perhaps a remembering of a biblical narrative. So here we go. The conventional wisdom of the Tower of Babel story is that the collapse was a misfortune, that it was the distraction or the weight of many languages that precipitated the tower's failed architecture, that one monolithic language would have expedited the building and heaven would have been reached. Whose heaven, she wonders, and what kind? Perhaps the achievement of paradise was premature, a little hasty if no one could take the time to understand other languages, other views, other narratives, period. Had they, the heaven they imagined might have been found at their feet. Complicated, demanding, yes, but a view of heaven as life, not heaven as post-life. So I think that this is a really philosophically interesting passage. For one, Morrison describes how language is not a tool of easy knowledge acquisition. Instead, it's something that's worked at and cultivated in the hopes of having real and true knowledge of other people. I also think it's interesting that she's thinking in terms of ideals like heaven, because a lot of philosophers do this. And I think one issue is that a lot of philosophers get stuck in idealizing things, of thinking of things that are perfect. And Morrison recenters lived experience, the concrete, and even goes as far as to say that that could be perfection when we communicate with each other and understand each other's narratives. So it almost seems like she's saying something about a kind of communal salvation that occurs when people are known, when narratives are known, when language is known. And so this segues into the big question for my thesis, which is what is Morrison, or according to Morrison, what does it mean to be known? And the reason I had this question is because I read her novels and I felt like I knew the characters, not just because they were quote unquote three-dimensional. There seemed to be kind of something more, like Pilate especially stands out to me, Sula. They're both elusive characters, but also have so much depth to them. So I started thinking about what Morrison does on the page that gives us this access to people, which from the quote above is something radical and important and urgent. So I kind of landed on considering Morrison's novels as an ecology of narratives. She includes master narratives, which are kind of social narratives that are broad, that give the framework for how certain people think their lives need to go. There's familial narratives about what a certain family is like. There are friendship narratives about how friends construct one another. And then there's an autobiographical narrative, which is how you conceive of yourself. And all of these narratives are at play for not every character, but for a lot of characters in Morrison's work. So now I'm going to read a little passage from Sula and kind of show you all what I mean when I talk about an ecology of narratives. So in this scene, Sula has just returned from going to college, from getting out of the bottom. She's returned to Nell, who has made her home in the bottom and has a husband named Jude and kids, whereas Sula is still unmarried, still without kids. So this is what it's like when Sula returns. It was like getting the use of an eye back, having a cataract removed. Her old friend had come home, Sula, who made her laugh, who made her see old things with new eyes, in whose presence she felt clever, gentle, and a little raunchy. Sula, whose past she had lived through, and with whom the present was a constant sharing of perceptions. Talking to Sula had always been a conversation with herself. Sula never competed. She simply helped others define themselves. Other people seemed to turn their volume on and up when Sula was in the room. More than any other thing, humor returned. She could listen to the crunch of sugar underfoot that the children had spilled without reaching for the switch, and she forgot the terror in the living room window shade. Even Nell's love for Jude, which over the years had spun a steady gray web around her heart, became a bright and easy affection, a playfulness that was reflected in their lovemaking. So I think that Morrison kind of expertly weaves all different levels and layers of narrative in this passage, and it's one example of many. In the background, there are narratives about motherhood and about being a wife, the expectations and the weight and all of the assumptions that come with those narratives. There's also the narrative about friendship, which is the most obvious and beautiful, that Sula gives Nell permission to see herself and to know herself. But her presence also kind of illuminates other relationships and other narratives, giving Nell the chance to even kind of revise her own conception of who she is as a person. So all of these narratives are working together in this scene, and I don't think it's an anomaly. I think it's how Morrison conceives of identity in her work. And just a tiny note on freedom before I turn it over. I think that where my work is kind of aiming towards is the idea that self-formation and writing a kind of biography or narrative of yourself can oftentimes like bump up against different master narratives that are in place to tell you what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a Black woman. And it's this kind of navigation of these narratives that are imposed on you that seem to be where there's the most agency and freedom. There's these kind of pockets, these moments. The Baby Suggs speech, I think, is one of them. Pilot is doing them all the time. She lives on the outskirts of town. She dresses differently. She doesn't have a navel. She is constantly challenging these narratives that tell her who to be. So I think Morrison would also think of freedom as integral to how we conceive of identity. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation. Thank you, Daryl, for hosting us. Thank you, George, for the tech. Thank you, Serena, Eric, and Margaret, for your comments today. And actually, there's actually going to be a direct through line to a lot of the comments that have been made. That's the fortune of going last, because you can just pretend like you knew this is all going to happen. Thank you all, too, especially for being here, for your presence here with us today. So today, I'd like to examine Toni Morrison's engagement with Brazil in two of her novels, Paradise, which I brought with me today, and A Mercy, and explain why this matters. I'll spend a few minutes laying out contexts. I'll briefly explain why Brazil needs to enter into the conversation. I'll then give a very brief plot summaries of both novels, I'm not going to give away any spoilers. I'm even going to read the ending of one of the books, and it won't be a spoiler, I promise. Finally, I'll look at two instances of Morrison incorporating Brazil into her writing. The novels I'm going to be talking about today. However, briefly, I'll argue that for Morrison, Brazil offers two things in particular. First, a way to represent a nuanced portrait of a multilingual global Black diaspora. And by diaspora here, I mean the globally scattered population of African-descended peoples, particularly in the Americas. And second, Brazil in her novels becomes a way of imagining the overwhelmingly large historical and geographic connections, as well as the disruptions that constitute this diaspora, especially in terms of lost histories, lost families, lost homelands, and a new world. Historically, Brazil represents an enormous catastrophe in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. The continuous kidnapping of West Africans by the Portuguese and then the Brazilians began in roughly 1500. So that's 16 years before the first Portuguese colony in Brazil. And it continued until 1866. The numbers are staggering. At the very least, 40% of enslaved Africans trafficked to the Americas were brought to Brazil. Thus, for more than 300 years, almost 6 million people were kidnapped and transported to Brazil. Even after Brazil outlawed the practice of transatlantic kidnapping in 1866, it wasn't even until 1888 that the country abolished slavery. With this history in mind, Brazil offers Morrison a distressing but important way to imagine the awful depths of loss, especially in terms of destroyed familial and cultural connections. Yet for Morrison, turning to Brazil also offers a way to remake, to reimagine, or as Serena would put it, to remember these lost connections. She reconstructs scattered lives and severed relationships. To make this reconstruction or this remembering happen, I'm going to say remember a lot. I didn't do it, but Serena did, and I think the way that you did it is so brilliant. So I'm going to revise as I go along, incorporating Dr. Johnson Rouliere's work. So to make this remembering happen, she leans on two very significant concepts, mercy and saudade, S-A-U-D-A-D-E. It's a very specifically Portuguese word. I'll explain these two concepts as they work in A Mercy in Paradise, and I'll do this as I summarize the two novels. So published in 2008, A Mercy is one of Morrison's final novels, and it's the text that reaches furthest back historically, although one could make an argument that Song of Solomon does in certain ways. That's a discussion for another time. It's set on and around the plantation of a Dutchman, Jacob Vark, in New York, and the women who live there, and also about the women who live there, while Vark lives and after Vark dies with smallpox. It's a multiracial group of women. Vark's Dutch wife, Rebecca, is there. There's a mixed race woman named Sorrow, a Native American enslaved person named Lena, and most central to the novel's, the short novel's plot, a young Black girl named Florence, who arrived in the Americas by way of Brazil. She has been sold away from her mother and her brother, and it's a moment that Florence thinks about over and over again as the novel progresses. Florence wonders why her mother gave her up, why her mother chose her baby brother instead. There's no answer the novel gives, except for one that we're given a brief glimpse of. To her mother, it was a mercy to give her daughter up, particularly because of the threats of sexual violence that confronted her. Mercy is a really complicated word, especially in the context of African American literature. In her most widely known poem on being brought from Africa to America, Phyllis Wheatley's opening line is, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land." But mercy, as Wheatley understood it, is a deeply conflicted term. Indeed, given Wheatley's well-documented fluency in Latin and Greek, mercy's roots in Latin are important here. Which the Oxford English Dictionary notes, the roots are classical Latin, merced, merces, which means wages, fee, bribe, rent, price, and commodity. It began to mean grace in about the 1500s or 1600s, but before that it meant exchange, commodity. So this shows that the word cuts twice. Toward a Christian understanding of mercy's relationship to grace, and toward a condemnation of Christianity's specific role in chattel slavery and the marketing of Black bodies as commodities. This connection to fee, bribe, rent, price, commodity cannot be understated. And this etymology provides a key insight into Wheatley's poetry that she leans into but also disrupts language's possibilities. Mercy is spiritual and it's physical. It is a state of grace that Wheatley prizes, but it's also a specific indictment of the geopolitics of chattel slavery. People are converted into spiritual salvation, but they're also converted into property. Mercy is conversion. Mercy is exchange. So with this context in mind, we can see just how deeply complicated mercy is for Morrison too. There's no right answer for Florin's mother, and there's no way to make sense of what mercy can possibly mean in this context. I will also note that Florin, Florin, which is slightly different, is a name for currency. So I think that Morrison may also be playing with that too. So Morrison shows that the origins of the Black diaspora in the Americas is a terrifying scene. But two, this diaspora is made up of impossible to understand love in the face of harrowing loss, of familial memories even after a family has been sundered by racism and economics. Now onto Paradise, published in 1998. It's part of actually her Gnostic trilogy. She begins with a quote from the Nag Hammadi, right? A text from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I also wanted to make a brief aside, which Dr. Mark Sanders reminded me of, and it's that Morrison edited Gail Jones's Corregidora, one of her first books, which is about Brazil. Right? I also briefly looked into her archives at Princeton University, desperately trying to find out if she was fluent in Portuguese. Her research assistant doesn't think so, but she had a collection of about 20 Portuguese language novels. So we'll see. Once I can get out there, we'll see. So this novel was published in 1998. The first section of Paradise begins with the words, "They shoot the white girl first." They are at first unnamed. And this sentence immediately sets the stakes of community really high by immediately establishing an extremist, violent, and unified they. They are a group of men from Ruby, Oklahoma, an all-Black town whose patriarchy feels threatened by the autonomous women who squat in a desacralized convent, simply known as the convent. So here comes the Catholicism. Several miles outside of Ruby. This act of violence by the men of Ruby seeks to abolish what they consider the most potent threat to their power, a group of autonomous women who refuse to acquiesce to them. They also provide spaces of safety for the women from Ruby. However, the men can't find any of the women after they shoot them. All of that shooting, and the bodies are nowhere to be found. So even though an act of violence initiates the novel, the rest of the text is an exploration of the women of the convent and the things that led them to that strange paradise in Oklahoma, as well as the people of Ruby, their history, their hopes, and their everyday lives. Paradise is one of Morrison's most challenging novels, and the final pages form a strange examination of the women's lives after they've been shot. Are they specters visiting people they know? Is this a magical realist text in which fantastical realities become commonplace? Is this an image of the afterlife as Morrison imagined it? Although unclear, it's precisely these final moments that I'm most interested in, and I'll tell you why. It's because I'm convinced that the final 3 paragraphs of Paradise are a translation of the famously untranslatable Portuguese word saudade. Saudade connotes the overwhelming feeling of missing someone or something. It can also mean a melancholy nostalgia for something that perhaps has not even happened. With this definition in mind, I'll read these last paragraphs to you, and I promise they don't contain any spoilers. And I'm also kicking myself that I didn't actually send it so you could all see it. So my apologies, everybody. This is Morrison. In ocean hush, a woman black as firewood is singing. Next to her is a younger woman whose head rests on the singing woman's lap. Ruined fingers troll the tea-brown hair. All the colors of seashells, wheat, roses, pearl, fuse in the younger woman's face. Her emerald eyes adore the black face framed in cerulean blue. Around them on the beach, sea trash gleams. Discarded bottle caps sparkle near a broken sandal. A small dead radio plays the quiet surf. There is nothing to beat the solace, which is what Piedade's song is all about. Although the words evoke memories neither one has ever had, of reaching age in the company of the other, of speech shared and divided bread smoking from the fire, the unambivalent bliss of going home to be at home, the ease of coming back to love begun. When the ocean heaves, sending rhythms of water ashore, Piedade looks to see what has come. Another ship, perhaps, but different, heading to port. Crew and passengers, lost and saved, a tremble, for they have been disconsolate for some time. Now they will rest before shouldering the endless work they were created to do, down here in paradise. Consolata, or Connie as she is called throughout the novel, finds herself in a timeless scene on an unnamed, unspecified beach. She encounters her long-lost, long-desired sister, Piedade. They were separated on the streets of Brazil, with Connie being brought to the United States and Piedade remaining in Brazil. Only Piedade's singing breaks the ocean hush. And I'm particularly struck by the sentence, "There's nothing to beat this solace," right? The words evoke memories neither one has ever had. Coming together after lifetimes of separation, the two women share memories they've never had. There's nothing to beat this utopian scene. And the song weaves together the memories that can only have been formed in a space of potential. This space is simultaneously past and future, as well as both memory and the impossibility of knowing what has never been. The suggestion that nothing can supersede the solace of Piedad the song is qualified by although, which immediately takes us to the borders of utopia, a space that can't exist, but that nevertheless does. A paradise built upon the impossible memories neither one has ever had. What is this impossibility that is nevertheless not out of the question? What does it mean to share experiences that are beyond the limits of possibility? The song's solace operates because of the impossible memories it creates. It makes something happen that couldn't have happened. It's a song of saudade, creating nostalgia and connection where there was previously loss and longing. These evoked memories take place in a past which did not happen, a potential past, a past in which Consolata was not taken from Brazil, in which there was no violence, either physical or emotional, that brought her to sorrow. The memories are of growing up together without being separated from each other, of words and dialogue and shared bread, of the unambivalent bliss of going home to be at home. Although these memories did not occur, they exist within this recuperative, remembered, and transformative space. I'll also note that in that paragraph, in those 3 paragraphs, she actually takes up the Nobel speech that Margaret read and thinks about what paradise means down here. Those are the final words. Deep within the contradiction of existing in this impossible space, there emerges a justice that awakens and confirms the psychic, spiritual, and historical pain and loss of the slave trade. And this justice also affirms the lives of Consolata and Piedade, whose physical lives were irrevocably sundered by the act of theft, just as their ancestors before them. In affirming their lives, this space, filled with Piedade's song, evokes, and it literally calls forth or out, memories that are mutually created and desired and impossible, defiantly refusing to be subsumed by the waves of traumatic history. This is an act of making connection in the face of loss, creativity in the face of destruction, of love in the face of that horror. For Morrison, this means imagining beauty and connection in the face of all that catastrophe. Mercy and saudade insist that we look at what's been lost, that we love each other in the face of that loss. Thank you.
That's just absolutely amazing, all 4 of you all. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you so much for your intellectual work. We have a good 20 minutes for questions and answers from our panelists. So if you have questions or comments, we ask that you come and talk into the microphone so that you can be heard by our online audience. Please.
So I read Toni Morrison when I was in high school, junior year, in The Bluest Eye, and it was amazing. The Bluest Eye it really takes your breath away because there are so many tropes inside of it, and there's so many iconic things that you remember and hold on to from that book, as with all of her novels, I think, at least the ones that I've read. When you hear there are people arguing to take her books out of school, to take her books out of classes, and that her books promote this idea of racism as opposed to critical race theory, What goes through your mind? Because what we all just sat and heard is something that I don't think is anywhere near racist. In fact, I think it illuminates so much about different races and cultures that some people may not be aware of. Anyone who wants to answer.
So I've been thinking a whole lot about this because it makes me really mad. And it makes me really mad first because the people who are screaming about critical race theory in the news have no idea what they're talking about. They don't know what the origin is. They don't know what it's about. They have read nothing. They've basically taken a term that sounds catchy and put it into a different context, which is completely confusing and makes no sense. And so what's really going on behind that is a fear of reality. It's a deep-seated fear. I think that there is a silent conversation going on in our country, which has been going on ever since the Civil War. It never really went away. It just got submerged. And you know, it only took 150 years to put them in the White House. That's why we have to get control over the vote. Because we have to keep how could that happen? And so I think there's a whole, I mean, if you think about Trump's audience, he had half of the voting population. It's a little bit scary. And those people didn't like what happened, and they will do anything. So the problem with CRT is complicated by the 1619 project, which became curriculum. And people are afraid to have their kids look at that, and they'd like us to think that that's teaching the kids to hate themselves as Americans, and that's not true.
Yeah, I'll also say that I think that there's one of Toni Morrison's friends and heroes was James Baldwin, who in A Fire Next Time argued that if we just refuse to talk about history, then we cannot actually talk about America at all. If we submerge these things, there literally is an impossible way. Like, we can't go forward. We cannot possibly proceed. And I'll also note that if kids aren't taught this, and maybe I'm going to slightly misquote Claude McKay here, but in one of his sonnets, The Lynching, he ends the poem by thinking about the little children dancing with glee around a body as it's burning. This is what we get otherwise, right? And this is terrifying, right? So if you do not learn that people are people, what are you learning? And I think that Morrison, more than anything, teaches us the absolute depths of humanity. This is something that from my first encounter with her to now, I don't think I've seen that before, right? No. So anyhow, enough about Morrison, right?
No, not enough about Morrison.
Do you want to respond to the?
I mean, it's a specter. I mean, like, this is, I don't, there's a critical race theory, you know, I've never really completely felt like I understood it, so I don't speak about it because, you know, when I think of critical race theory, I think of some very specific, like, legal framework that belongs in somebody's classroom that I'm not in. You know, so but like there are pieces of critical race theory that also seem pretty obvious, like race as a social construct. So that's a piece that's not critical race theory, right? But it's not, you know, it comes from sociology. And it's embedded, kind of implied in much of Black literature, and certainly in Toni Morrison. I think it's a specter. I think it's just an opportunity to try to create a narrative and a fight that we just don't need. And I also want to just say one more thing about that. Just like I think that people think about knowledge as if it's pure. And if there's a version of teaching history and teaching children that does not take perspective, right? That doesn't exist, right? There is no perspectiveless teaching, right? Or learning, quite frankly. So you're always taking perspective. The question is the teacher helping you to see that there is, in fact, more than one perspective? and to learn to interrogate your own so that you can, and the ones around you. And so, the intersectionality as their varying ways. I mean, you're getting a narrative from the society, but from your parents, from the culture, about what it means to be male, about what it means to be female. I would also say that there's no way around that. There is no way around that. We can't undo that, right? We can move it. We can make more space within it, but we can't stop being male and female. Right? We don't or even if we are in the between, which we could very well be, or in something else, but these categories will always exist. And so that they just, at the very least, need more space within them. But my point here is that there is no way out of people passing on some kind of perspective when they teach us. It's not, in other words, education is not morally neutral. There is no such thing. Right? So the notion that we can fix the problem, I think there are real issues when it comes to critical race, when it comes to teaching. We respond to what happened 2 years ago with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and people say, they got in the classroom, they're like, right? And they might not have been so critical about their choices, about what they said and how they said it. And then people responded. But the reality is, this is long overdue. So that's what I would say, and it won't happen. I mean, it will, but it won't. You cannot suppress knowledge. You cannot. In the end, you cannot. As Benjamin Sisko, I'm a Star Trek fan, said, you cannot destroy an idea. He said, right? I created it. You cannot get rid of it, right? Yeah. Sorry.
Do you want to say something? Because I'd like to add something if you don't.
The only thing I would like to add is the House bill in Indiana. One of the scary things about it, and I think you mentioned this, is that it takes into account how the students will feel, and that's one of the main reasons that they want to ban certain texts. And thinking about that, it's just so obvious that they care about how white children feel, because Black children of color, they face racism every day, and it's not about that. Clearly, they're disregarding their emotions in place of the white children's emotions.
Right. Well, I think that one of the problems that we face is that our media have split, and now because of what's happened to our society digitally, you really don't have to hear anything you don't want to hear. And, if you don't like it, you can just sort of cut that out of your world. You can listen to whoever, speaks a party line that fits with you. You never have to know anything about anybody else. And I think that's why disinformation is such a problem now. Because all you need to do really is spin a narrative, put it in the right spot, and that narrative will have a life of its own, and it can be just as untrue as it is, but it will have a life of its own, and there will be followers, and they will listen to that. I mean, for me, one of those is that if you take the vaccine, they're going to put a chip in you, and that chip is going to let them track you I mean, come on, really? But there are people who have latched on to that.
It's affirmation over confirmation.
Right. And to me, that's a really big problem that we have.
Is there another question? Please.
Hello. Thank you so much for allowing for us to hear from you all today. I really enjoyed the panel. The question that I had is, how do you all see Toni Morrison's work and its depiction of resistance and liberation, especially in relation to white supremacy? And then next, a question that I think a lot about, and it kind of derives from a quote that I've heard from Toni Morrison herself, is when talking about, I think it's Richard Wright's Invisible Man, she says, invisible to who? So I wonder how you all are thinking about whiteness and avoiding centering whiteness in your own work, because a lot of her work, it centers the Black experience, particularly the way that Black women navigate the space.
So in terms of specifically resistance, I would highly suggest reading Paradise, my favorite novel, but for a couple of reasons. First, because it's about an all-Black town, which is a true phenomenon that happens not just in the South, but also in the Midwest and the West. So Oklahoma had the highest number of all-Black towns per capita in all the US. Indiana also had a huge number of all-Black towns, right? This is specifically a response to migration, but also to sundown towns. So Ruby, the town here, is specifically established as an all-Black town that refuses to allow white people in. This is really economically and politically powerful at first, but certain problems arise. And a lot of critics have argued that this is Morrison's attempt to deal with Black nationalism. What are the positives? What are the ways that patriarchy actually took over? How is there a feminist resistance to this? And the convent actually features a space of resistance. So one of the biggest arguments is about what the quote is on the hearth at the center of town that the original founders of Ruby brought. And I'm not gonna remember it and I'm not gonna search through it, but the argument is about whether it says, now I remember, be the furrow of his brow, or we are the furrow of his brow. So this question is it going to be a specific type of resistant nationalism? Or is it going to be a sort of analogical relationship to Yahweh? And so she takes explicitly this question of politics, of resistance, what it means to just not even to cede centrality or even marginality to a certain degree to whiteness. And I'll say, when she says they shoot the white girl first, at the very beginning of the novel, she never actually tells us who the white girl is, of all the women in the convent, because she doesn't want to, right? So this is a really fascinating book. I would highly recommend Paradise, again. Yeah, this is what I'm here for tonight.
This is, I'm just finishing listening to, there's an audio version of Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. And it's interesting because I always think about Toni Morrison, who's really not interested in white people, largely. Not, I mean, she is, because a lot of people around her, it's not like she doesn't love white people, but it's like, she says, when I write, she's writing like so many other writers around the world who are writing decidedly in her own cultural context, which is Black, right? The subjects are Black, and white people who may show up are not the center of the narrative. So she and yet in this book, it's really interesting because I think it's so insignificant that she demonstrates that she has read everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? She has read everybody, and she appreciates so many people. And you know, she mentions Flannery O'Connor, and who has a complicated, very interesting relationship with racism that we're now talking about more than we've ever before, who sees racism and talks about it and yet is racist. Yeah. Right? She's really complicated. She's this amazing Catholic writer, American Catholic writer, who is both implicated and also has the capacity to see. And Toni Morrison, I think, knew that even and really liked and appreciated Flannery O'Connor. But in the end of the book, she starts reading, and I mean reading in a very particular way, reading Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, and one of, I don't remember the guy's name now, I'm blanking on it, another great, large,
Hemingway, right?
Was it? Hemingway, right? And is taking this look and saying, look how Blackness in their writing is there to bolster whiteness and construct whiteness. And this is really interesting stuff. She's doing that work. It's important, but that's not what she does in her own work, her own novels. She doesn't do that. I mean, she foregrounds Black women and foregrounds Black people in general. And And so I would like to say that maybe we ought to take a page and see that as useful, right? It's not that she doesn't stop offering critique. She does offer critique, but she also doesn't stop there, right? It's not enough to deconstruct. This is, I think, really important. It's not enough to deconstruct whiteness and Americanness and all the things and reconstruct nothing. Because actually we need a world to live in, right? And so I think really, really important that we spend time galvanizing and constructing and excavating an experience that is not naturalist. Me personally, I don't want to live in a world where only Black people live. It's not my version of a good world. But that supports Black life, right? To be honest with you, I think that Blackness in America is akin to Jewishness in the Bible. The experience of it's got a almost religious dimension to it. And I'm biased because I'm religious, but I really, I really do believe that you can't pass through what our people have passed through, and not have that ultimate sense, that need for ultimate meaning, right, embedded in our story, right, from slavery to freedom, for example, right, and that's also our gift to the American community that was born in struggle. Right? And it's why people keep coming to our stuff and saying, ooh, I want to taste that. Because the numinous, right, is there. And it's powerful and it cannot be missed.
So for me, that book, Playing in the Dark, just in terms of resistance, absolutely blew my mind. Because when it came out, there was nothing out there like that. And for my whole academic career, I've been struggling with trying to rip up the system that has created this and that sustains and maintains it through language. And she's definitely on that, like speaking to that, the Nobel speech that you brought up. In that Nobel speech, she describes her relationship to language as one of epistemology. And she says also, I don't remember if she says it exactly there, but she says, we do language. And when she does language in that book, there's something that she does in Playing in the Dark that sort of rips a hole in our entire system. And this is the moment where she describes the new man. And she does a narrative about this new man. It's a whole narrative of how this person who's really not really anything in Europe manages to come to the New World. And in the New World, all of a sudden, he's like, wait a minute. I have these Black people over here. And, I can like stand on top of them, and I can be like all those other people on the other side of the ocean who were standing on me. And because I'm not even aware of how pissed off I am about that, I'm going to treat them really badly. And in so doing, recreate myself. And when I recreate myself, I'm going to be on top of everything, and I will be a facsimile of what I escaped. And when I read that, I thought that is the kernel of the illness. That's it. You turn Black people into a thing, and when they are a thing, that sort of emphasizes your humanity because you stole it from somebody else. So I go back from there to Patricia Williams in The Alchemy of Race and Rights, who said, I just have to get over being 3/5 of a human being. I'm still there trying to get over that so that I can move on into other things, but that's what it is. So I think that in her resistance, what she really attempted to do was to strip it of everything and then boldly, courageously go into the truth and tell it like it is. She just told it like it is without worrying about anything, and took control of a narrative that she felt belonged to her. That's what I think is really important, and that is what she teaches. And in some ways, it's also very much akin to James Baldwin, because he did the same thing in trying to use his own voice, particularly in Giovanni's Room, where he was told, you are not allowed to have a white character. You cannot write about a white man like that. But James Baldwin was living in France. And so his mentality was just so different from being outside of this, that what he was trying to do in doing that was basically showing that it's not race, it's something else. And so I think it's really important for us to think about that and to figure out what's on the other side of that, because we're all affected by it. Black, white, everybody, anybody who's here. And I just want to add one more thing, which is that I have recently, I read Adichie, her book, Americana. It's really fascinating. I've recently had some contact with Nigerian students as well, one who's in high school in Chicago, and I'm noticing all these similarities about what it is to be Black, but yet not Black, and then come here and you become Black. And you know, the issues that they have with that being Black, yet not being Black. So I think Morrison is riding on the edge of all of that and trying to explode it, and she's just, it's amazing.
This is real testament to the power of her prose and just the richness of your intellectual work, that this conversation could keep going on. We are at time, but I think we have time for one more question. Is that okay? Isaiah, did you?
Got a question.
This will be our last question.
First of all, thank you all for very powerful and important presentations. So this question is for all four of you if you want to answer it. So I wonder if you all can talk about the way in which Morrison uses the actual Black body in relation to these texts, especially regarding Black resistance. And a lot of her texts she uses, or there's a lot of very violent scenes regarding the Black body, in fact. So I'm wondering if you can all talk about what that might mean and why is she using that, especially again in relation to Black resistance. How can Black resistance be possible even with this regard to violence against the Black body?
I think that's a really powerful question. I'm going to start with her novel Home and move backwards. I'll try to go very quickly. But Home is her attempt to deal with the Korean War, which is a war she argues that African-American literature, and especially Anglo-American literature, has not taken up very much. There's an interesting exception. Mexican-American literature is obsessed with the Korean War, actually. But that's a conversation for another day. It really is. But what does it mean to be a traumatized war veteran? And she also brings up the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, but also the ways that eugenics were practiced on Black women in this very short book. And in A Mercy, the Black body is a site of violence, specifically because it's in colonial times, but it's also the space of unbearable love. And how Florence, she's trying to find the blacksmith that she had her first romantic encounter with. She's supposed to be going out and getting medicine, but she decides to find the blacksmith instead. And this is a really powerful moment. The body as a space both of violence, but also of love. It's eros in a very specific way. I was about to go through every novel. No, I'm not. I will end by saying this, Song of Solomon's conclusion, which is an extraordinary conclusion, right? This is why I would say that Song of Solomon actually is before A Mercy, because it's taking up the idea of the Flying Dutchman, or the Flying African, who finds his way back to Africa. And that final gesture, I'm not going to spoil it, but the final gesture is this absolute embodiment, right, of that resistance, but we don't know where it goes when we don't know where it ends. So I think for Morrison, leaving that openness is so important for resistance too, right? It's a never-ending struggle, right? It can't have a conclusion. So that's where I'll stop.
I think I can add on from 2 other books, just to continue your line of thinking. And I'm thinking first of Sula, when Sula as a child, she's confronted with these bullies who are Irish Catholics who have chosen to target the Black people in the town to, rise above them and kind of have a better social status. And she wants to go on the quickest way to school, and they keep getting in her way. And the way that she eventually kind of scares them off and stops them is by cutting off part of her own finger. So sacrificing a part of herself and putting her own body on the line is like the only way that she can kind of have the kind of like structural access to the shortest path to school. And then in Beloved, Setha's back is what I'm thinking of, which is scarred and torn up from slavery, from the whips that she was hit with. And it's transformed through metaphor into a tree that's touched with love. And so kind of reimagining the scars as something new is also a form of resistance.
I just want to say that I would go back to the story, the news story that motivated Morrison to write Beloved. That's the story of Margaret Garner, who escaped to Ohio with her children and who was in the process of killing her children and herself as the slave catchers were coming to get her in response to the 1850 fugitive slave law that allowed them to do that. Well, I think that's a moment that is so powerful, both in terms of history, but also in terms of that juncture for Morrison, because this is a moment where mother love is so intense that instead of fostering life, it fosters death. And it's that dichotomy, it's that moment of love that is death and that is violent out of love, because she just didn't want that child to suffer the return to slavery so much that it was better to kill it. And the whole book turns around that, and we have to ask the question, well, is she someone that Paul D should have said, you don't have 4 legs, you have 2? Is that true? We have to question what that means to be so upset that there is the possibility of slavery for your child, that you must overcome your desire to help it survive and kill it. It's a really serious problem. So I think that really speaks to the question about the violence to Black bodies, which are already ensconced in violence, but it also speaks to what you were saying about, both of you were saying about, the body being a space of love, that it must be loved despite its injuries, despite the violence it suffers. Despite all that, there must still be love, and that love can transform it.
Eric, would you like to give us the final?
First, I'm upset that you didn't let me go before you.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So that I wouldn't be going last.
So sorry.
But it's okay. I didn't want to go last. I think that this is a great example of Toni Morrison as a philosopher, right? Because she enters into this conversation about Setha is a real subject here, right? Setha is the one who is faced with an extraordinary moral problem, right? that she has made a decision about how she's going to deal with it, that everybody in the book, and I mean Black people, don't all agree with. They really struggle with her choice, right? But she made that choice. And then she lives with the ramifications of her choice. And she engaged in infanticide, right? And Toni Morrison allows her to be, writes her as a full, complex human being with a real situation. The actual text I was thinking about was from this book, which is her speech she gave at Harvard at this conference, and the title of it is Altruism. The speech is on altruism and the literary imagination, and she talks about altruism or goodness, and she makes a reference specifically to an Amish community where someone came into an Amish school and opened fire and shot children.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Right, and she's fascinated by how the media covered it, and then what they didn't know what to do with it because the Amish decided that they were not going to pursue, conventional justice, and that they comforted the man who killed himself after killing the other people. They comforted his family as much as they comforted their own families, and they tore down the school and they rebuilt the school, and then they moved on. Right, and she's just fascinated by this. And when she talks about, she says, I've never been. First, she says, of course, thinking about goodness indeed requires a view of its opposite. Right? I have never been interested in or impressed by evil itself, but I have been confounded by how attractive it is to others. I am stunned by the attention given to its every whisper and shout, which is not to deny its existence and ravage, nor to suggest evil does not demand confrontation, but simply to wonder why it is so worshipped, especially in literature. Is its theatricality, its costume, its bloody spray, its emotional satisfaction that comes with the investigation more than it is with its collapse? Perhaps it is how it dances, the music it inspires, its clothing, its nakedness, its sexual disguise, its passionate howl, and its danger. The formula in which evil reigns is bad versus good, but the deck is stacked because goodness in contemporary literature seems to be equated with weakness, as pitiful. Right, and she goes on. But I think that the thing, I didn't want to really end here, not sure where I wanted to end, but I wanted to end with saying that it seems to me that her work, it allows us to see that the evil, but then it focuses in perhaps on goodness that is relational and human, right, and small. And she says that's not weakness.
Yeah.
Right, that it will never get rid of evil in that way, but it's not weakness. That those human relationships that's where goodness happens, where grace happens.
Paul D. ends beloved saying, I'm going to put my story next to yours.
Yes.
Absolutely. I want to say thank you to the Civil Rights Heritage Center, to Daryl Heller, to George Garner. I want to say thank you all for coming, and you stayed well past the hour, and you were engaged, and I think, again, that's just testament to the power of the art. And ultimately, I want to thank our four panelists for taking us through an intellectual journey and an engagement with Toni Morrison's work that far exceeded certainly my expectations. I've been reading and studying her for years, and I felt like I was just beginning listening to you all. I cannot believe how many new ideas and rich ideas we were confronted with today. Thank you so much. So please join me in thanking our panelists.